स्ट्रेंथनिंग इन द इनर बीइंग एक डिस्कोर्स है बाय सोरन कीरकेगार्ड जो उसने अपनी किताब 3 अपबिल्डिंग डिस्कोर्सेज में पब्लिश किया इन 1843। इस किताब में 3 डिस्कोर्सेज हैं जिनमें वो अपनी कंटिन्यू करता है डिस्कशन ऑन द डिफरेंस बिटवीन एक्सटर्नैलिटीज़ एंड इनवर्डनेस। लेकिन जहाँ उसने पहले बात की थी अबाउट द इनवर्डनेस ऑफ फेथ, इस किताब में स्पेसिफिकली इन दिस डिस्कोर्स वो बात करते हैं अबाउट द इनवर्डनेस ऑफ लव। वो कहता है कि इन द एक्सटर्नल वर्ल्ड एवरीथिंग इज़ चेंजिंग, लेकिन इनर स्पिरिचुअल वर्ल्ड में सिर्फ एक ही चीज़ कांस्टेंट है, सिर्फ एक ही चीज़ है जो चेंज नहीं करती है। ही सेज दैट इन दीज वर्ड्स, व्हाट इज़ इट दैट नेवर चेंजेस इवन दो एवरीथिंग इज़ चेंज्ड? इट इज़ लव, एंड दैट अलोन इज़ लव दैट विच नेवर बिकम्स समथिंग एल्स। Love is dependent on how a person sees, and when the individual sees with love, that individual can see away sin in himself as well as the sin of the whole world, just as Christ did. Kierkegaard different examples, different reference points use करता है to explain something in his discourses. इस discourse में वो अपोस्टल पॉल को एज ए रेफरेंस पॉइंट ले रहा है और अपोस्टल पॉल की circumstances और उनकी लाइफ से वो मिसालें बयान करता है इस डिस्कोर्स में, just like he uses Abraham as the reference point, as the ideal in fear and trembling. He used Prophet Ayub or Job in repetition, and almost in most of his religious discourses he uses some kind of an example, a prophetic reference to explain something specific in the discourse. ये सब examples हैं उन individuals की who saw their expectancy crash, but they survived that because they were strengthened in the inner being. Kierkegaard बात करते हैं इस डिस्कोर्स में कि अपोस्टल पॉल was a prisoner in Rome. He was imprisoned, but he had a teaching and he had an unshakable conviction that this teaching would be victorious over the whole world. Even when he was imprisoned, he did not lose hope. He knew that his patience would be rewarded, and this is something, this inwardness is something जो आप किसी third individual को explain नहीं कर सकते हो. This is a paradox in Kierkegaard's eyes कि जो inwardness of faith है especially, that you have faith even in adversity, you have faith even when you're imprisoned. ये faith you cannot explain directly to other individuals. This is what he means at times by inwardness, कि you're strengthened in your inner being, लेकिन साथ ही साथ आप अपनी inwardness किसी और individual को share नहीं कर सकते, उनको बता नहीं सकते क्योंकि वो समझेंगे नहीं. What kind of a person would try to understand that someone who the world despises, who the people imprisoned, would be in his heart strengthened in his inner being, because nobody can understand that. So for Kierkegaard, the one solution is to turn inward, to embrace your inwardness and to celebrate your inwardness even when you're facing great misfortune. He says, Paul was a witness, not a doubter, who lets everything around it change and give itself up as a willing prey to life's fickle, capricious changes, without being alarmed by such a world, without being concerned for itself. But this concern announces itself within the individual in such a way that it craves an explanation, a witness that explains the meaning of everything for it, and its own meaning by explaining it in the God who holds everything together in his eternal wisdom, and who assigned to man to be Lord of creation by his becoming God's servant, and explained himself to him by making him his co-worker. And through every explanation that he gives a person, he strengthens and confirms him in his inner being. This is what strengthened Paul in prison. He did not run away from every explanation. He did not fill time with perpetual deliberation. In his concern, the inner being announces itself. The inner being that is concerned not about the whole world, but only about God and only about itself, about the explanation that makes the relation understandable to it, and about the witness that confirms it in the relation. Kierkegaard ये कहना चाह रहा है कि even though Paul was imprisoned और सब लोग उसके खिलाफ थे, he did not lose hope, for he was strengthened in the inner being. But now Paul, did he live in the favor of the mighty so that it could commend his teaching? No, he was a prisoner. Did the wise hail his teaching so that their reputation could guarantee its truth? No, to them it was foolishness. Was his teaching capable of quickly supplying the individual with a supernatural power? Did it offer itself for sale to people through legerdemain? No, it had to be acquired slowly, appropriated in the ordeal that began with the renunciation of everything. Did Paul then have any witness? Yes, indeed he had every human witness against him, and in addition He had the concern that the congregation would lose heart, or worse yet, be offended at him, because offense surely is never closer than when truth is oppressed, when innocence suffers, when injustice is sure of its victory, when violence is on the increase, when ignorance does not even need to use power against the good, but, careless and unconcerned, remains ignorant of its existence. But does Paul, forsaken by the witness, despair? By no means. Since he had no other witness to appeal to, he appeals to his hardships. Is this not like a miracle? If Paul had not otherwise effectively demonstrated that he had the power of miracle, is this not a demonstration? To transform hardships into a witness for the truth of a teaching, to transform disgrace into glory for oneself and for the believing congregation, to transform the lost cause into a matter of honor that has all the inspiring force of a witness. Is this not like making the cripples walk and the mute speak? Therefore, what the apostle desires for every individual in the congregation is what he himself was, what his whole life demonstrates. Even if the situation in his day was different, even if struggle and conflict made it more necessary, but also perhaps more difficult to attain this in strengthening in the inner being, nevertheless, for all ages and in all circumstances, it remains the one thing needful for a person to save his soul in this inner strengthening. After all, every person in all ages does indeed have his struggle and his spiritual trial, his distress, his solitude in which he is tempted, his anxiety and powerlessness when the witness slips away. Kierkegaard फिर कहता है कि even in adversity and in this example, even when Paul was imprisoned, he was only concerned about God. He says in these words, the person in whose soul the inner being announced itself in that concern of which we speak, the person whose soul no human being's love filled in such a way that the witness departed from his thoughts, that person probably never found people to be as that wronged person found them, and yet he perhaps found them to be different from what he had hoped and wished them to be. But even though the terrible thing happened, even though people rose up against him as assailants or deserted him as deceivers, even though the enemy persecuted him, even though the friend betrayed him, even though envy laid snares for his feet, what were they able to do to him? They could increase his concern. They could help him to drive from his soul every feeling through which he belonged to creation in such a way that it did not also belong to the Creator. But they could not prevent the concern about God that was present in his soul from seeking its object more deeply and inwardly. And one who seeks God always finds, and he who constrains a person to seek, helps him to find. Then his soul in its concern sought more and more inwardly until he found the witness. The person who loves God is strengthened in the inner being, and the person who loved people and only through this love learned, as it were, to love God, has had only an imperfect upbringing. But the person who loved God and in this love learned to love people was strengthened in the inner being. If someone denied him his love, then that person helped him to find God's love, which is more blessed than anything that arose in a human heart. If some friend denied him comfort, then he helped him to find God's comfort, which is beyond measure. If the world denied him its approval, then it helped him to seek God's, which passes all understanding. Kierkegaard कहता है कि even though Paul was imprisoned and he met great misfortune, it did not keep him from remembering God and from being strengthened in the inner being. Kierkegaard इस discourse को end करता है in these words. The very first, so they say, is the most beautiful, and the heart is attached to it. To the first person who welcomed him in the hour he was counted among the living, the first sky that arched over the place of his birth, to the first language that is called his mother tongue, to the first people who are called his ancestors, to the first teaching that expanded his soul, to the first peers who understood him, to the first idea that inspired him, to the first love that made him happy. Blessed is the person who could truthfully say, God in heaven was my first love. Blessed is the person whose life was a beneficent strengthening of this love. Blessed is the person who, even though in his life he made the mistake of taking the outer instead of the inner, even though his soul in many ways was ensnared by the world, yet was again renewed in the inner being by turning back to his God, strengthened in the inner being.